Judge Hankinson just finishing up jury instructions. Here is Prosecutor John Fuchs with his opening statement.
Hey, it worked. I'm always surprised when technology actually works the way you want it to. First thing I'd like to do is thank you. I know yesterday I thank you for taking part in the jury selection process. You were, in fact, now been selected to be the juror in this particular case, State of Florida versus Henry Segura. And I'd like to thank you. You were selected because myself, Mr. Prince, Mr. Segura, and of course the judge, all felt you were the best ones to come in and listen to the evidence throughout the course of the trial, testimonial, look at the photographs, unfortunately. Thank you very much. Once again, we cannot do this without you. That being said, why are you here? Ladies and gentlemen, you are here because on November 20th, 2010, law enforcement officers responded to 908 Saddle Creek Run. This is the home of Brandi Peters, her twins, Tamaya and Tanaya Peters, and her son, Devontae Segura. Devontae Segura also is the son of Henry Segura, the accused in this particular case. What the officers found when they arrived, Brandi Peters brutally shot and beaten. In the back room, they found Tamaya, Tanaya, and Devontae in the bathtub. One of them shot, two of them drowned. And what the evidence is going to show you is that Henry Segura is responsible for the murders. You're going to hear throughout the course of this that he was interviewed by Tallahassee Police Department on 2 different occasions, days apart. First one was to notify them of the death of his son, and the second was follow-up. And what he did is he lied to law enforcement. He said, I was not there, I was at home the entire time. Tallahassee Police Department did their investigation, realized he was lying, called him in for a second interview to clarify. I was at home all the time, checked my cell phone records. They say I was there. But he made a mistake. He thought he could pull one over the eyes of the Tallahassee Police Department. What they did is they found out he had a separate phone number that he didn't tell them about. And what they did when they checked that cell phone record is they determined he was in fact there at the time that Brandi Peters and the kids were killed. And it goes farther from there. So the question is, once we make the determination, what the evidence is going to show you, that Henry Segura had the motive, he had a means, and he had the opportunity to commit these murders, and he did in fact commit them. The next question is, how did we get there?
Somebody phone going up. Let's not interrupt court, please.
As I said, law enforcement officers responded to the Saddle Creek Run home on November 20th, 2010. This home is located over by the fairgrounds, Capitol Stadium, Tram Road, Paul Russell Road, South Monroe Street. And there's the 4-point area right here. Law enforcement officers respond, they get a call. It was actually Artron Timmons who went up there first to do a check because his mom calls him and tells him to go look, but they haven't heard anything from Brandi Peters that day. He walks up and sees blood outside the home. Calls law enforcement. Officer Jernigan, Officer Kidd respond first and foremost, and they approach the home. They go into the home, and they were able to force entry by breaking a window, and they realized what was happening there. They're later joined by Sean Wyman, Officer Tallahassee Police Department, and they go into the home and they found what you've already seen. What you're going to hear next, of course, is that they withdraw from the house. Once they clear the house, make sure nobody's still alive, make sure nobody's still hiding in the house. They withdraw from the house. They secure the scene. This is the home there on Saddle Creek Run. Secure it with tape. You can see here the window that they had to break in order to gain entry to the home. And they contact the Criminal Investigative Division of Tallahassee Police Department. Investigator Mark Lewis is assigned to be the primary lead investigator of this case. The lead investigator is kind of like the head coach of a football team, or any other team for that matter. And the fact that he doesn't necessarily do all the investigative aspects of it, but he's kind of the leader of them, and he assigns his assistant coaches, if you will, to do different roles throughout the course of the investigation. You're going to hear that crime scene investigators were called. I know we talked a little bit about CSI shows and stuff like that, but they are, in fact, real-life crime scene investigators. Annie Pressey is the primary investigator for this particular case from Crime Scene. April DeBrava is another investigator that's assigned to the Criminal Investigative Division, and what her role is to be a liaison between the crime scene investigators as they're processing the entire crime. They, of course, have training to do so. You're going to hear that there's a lot of blood in this. Throughout the entire house, they process the entire house room by room by room. April DeBrava's role is to do a liaison, to look from things from an investigative standpoint as an investigator rather than a crime scene specialist. She also reports back, of course, as I said, she would be one of the assistant coaches for Mark Lewis. And they do, in fact, process the scene. They look for the evidence in the house. They look for evidence around the victims, and of course, outside the home. And they start asking questions. They start asking questions to the family member. Who does she know? Why is this important? It's important to know who she knows because of the brutality of this. Law enforcement suspects that it's somebody she knew because of the brutality of it. So they want to know who she knows, who's possibly responsible, who can give them leads as to who she may have been seen with the night before, things along those lines. They start asking questions about time frames. Again, she's found early in the morning. Time frames, when the last time somebody seen them? When you saw them last, what were they doing? Things along those lines. Gender information, habits, time to eat, time the kids go to bed, things along those lines. And what they find out is that she does, in fact, have her cell phone on her all the time, much like most of us do. Has the phone on her all the time, constantly using it. They find out that she was last seen the night before in the late afternoon, early evening hours. That the twins, one of the twins and Javante actually were seen with Burger King wrappers shortly after they had eaten Burger King, or appeared to be shortly after they had eaten Burger King. They talked to friends, find out when she was last talked to. Last talked to again, late afternoon, early evening hours. Of course, they find out how the bodies were discovered. As I mentioned earlier, Artron's mom calls over there, can't get Brandi to respond. It's out of ordinary because of the fact that she usually responds to her cell phone. And she sends her son over there, at which point he comes back and reports to law enforcement. They find out a possible boyfriend she's with. Does she have any boyfriends, family members? And they also find out about the fathers of the children. And when they find out it's the father of the children, for Tamaya and Tanaya, the twins, is Antonio Anthony. And the father of Javante Segura is, in fact, Henry Segura. It's obviously important because you've got to let them know about what happened. What they also do is they take a look at Brandi's cell phone. Try and see if they can narrow some things down. Who's she been talking to last? They find out around 6:11 to 6:15, it's a call between Brandi and her mom. You get a text from 6:53 from Cece Timmons, Artron Timmons' mom, that we just talked about. They also find out that 6:53 text is the last active communication on Brandi's phone. These are terms you're going to start hearing. You're probably going to learn a lot more about cell phones than you ever thought possible. But there's a difference. Active communication is one in which the recipient of the phone, Brandi in this particular case, is sending something out. That is an active communication. It means they're actively participating in the conversation. There are also passive events. Passive events are things that are incoming. Someone calling and leaving a voicemail, calling a text message with no response, things along those lines. And what they find out, of course, is that 6:53 was the last active communication. At 7:13 is a passive event, incoming. 7:49, another passive event. And finally, at 8:21, a routed event. And what you're going to learn is a routed event is one that happens when the phone is shut down. when it can't communicate with a tower. Battery removed, turned off, something along those lines. And that 821, the phone has been powered down at 821 and never heard from again. And you're going to see an analysis of Brandi's phone. And this here, whoops. And this is that, in fact, analysis. And what you can see here is we're enlarging the time frame, and it starts 1 week prior to the homicide. And these are all the communications that she has during that course of that week. Both active and passive. But you can see it's in constant use. Look at the time frame. Every couple of seconds, every couple of minutes, she's using that phone. Constantly. She's on it constantly. Now, each one of these lines are going to be later explained to you what they all mean by Chris Corbett. He's going to explain what each one of these lines are. But right here, what we're talking about is the time and date. And that's it. It just stops. And it stops, and it's never heard from again at 8:21. So that begs the question, why did it stop? And why is that 6:53 the last active communication? Is that the time period in which the murder occurred? You're of course going to hear that there was an autopsy conducted. Autopsy on both Brandi and the children. And you're going to find and hear that there was food that was found in the stomach of Tamaya and Tanaya. You're going to hear from Dr. Flanagan, who was the autopsy and medical examiner, about the time frames that were involved. And it would be a couple of hours, if you would, roughly. Can't hammer down an exact time. Again, this isn't CSI TV. But the general idea would be within a couple of hours of their death, they'd eat. Again, you go back to Artron Timmons' testimony about the fact that he last saw them eating Burger King in the late afternoon or early evening hours of that 19th. And that is in fact consistent with the Brandi's phone becoming inactive at that time period. In addition to that, you'll see photographs in the crime scene. There's an open food canister there on the table. Spoon's still in it. Again, eating patterns, roughly early evening, or late afternoon, early evening. Consistent. So at this point, law enforcement has determined who she knows, who she communicates, who's the father of her children, possibly what time the deaths occurred, and they start looking, trying to figure out who may have possibly had a motive. Law enforcement, training experience, Typically, in a crime scene such as this, you're talking about money, love, jealousy, things along those lines. That's usually what you primarily look at first and foremost. Who has the means? Who's got the ability to do this? Because of the crime scene, the brutality of this, who's got the ability to do this with the strength that it would cause? Because you're going to hear from the medical examiner that part of the skull was actually crushed. The bone was crushed. Who's got that kind of strength? Murder weapon. What was the murder weapon? You're going to hear from Florida Department law enforcement analyst Jeff Foggy that in fact what happened here is a .32 caliber pistol, most likely. 32 calibers are interesting. You're going to hear that 32 calibers actually have two different kinds of bullets that go with it. There are 32 caliber long and 32 caliber short. And what you're going to hear is that if somebody puts the wrong ammunition in a different gun, they use, for instance, in this case, a 32 short when it should be a 32 long, the weapon will fire, but it doesn't fire right. In other words, it doesn't gain the velocity that is needed to actually penetrate a skull and do the damage you would normally think of regarding the bullet. Then we go back to Dr. Flanagan's autopsy. And what we find is that that's exactly what happened here. That these bullets that entered Brandi didn't do so with the velocity you normally would expect. They actually didn't penetrate bone in some way, in some instances. What that tells us is that whoever it is may not have known quite how to use a gun properly. Wasn't real familiar with firearms. So the question is, murder weapon, who had one? But at the same time, just because you have one doesn't mean you necessarily know how to use it right. Who could that be? Who had the opportunity? Who was there? Who had access to the kids? Who had access to Brandi, to the home? You're going to hear that this was not a forced entry. The door wasn't kicked in. It was kicked in eventually by law enforcement, but when they respond, nobody kicked the door in. Nobody forced their entry. So somebody was led into this home. You're going to find Henry Segura. Initial interview, notify him because of a child. Look for nonverbal cues, emotional, lack of emotion, deceptions, and of course they apply common sense in conducting these interviews. You're going to have an opportunity to see it. Henry Segura is told his son is killed. Doesn't show any emotion. And we talked about that in opening statements. Not everybody grieves in the same way. Didn't show any emotions. Again, I was home on the 19th. Was there all night. Wasn't me. Couldn't have done it. Told law enforcement to check his phone records. He gives a phone number of 5. That's my phone number. Check it. Phone records say I was home. So the next day, he went in the morning. He went to his friend Silas Thornton's house. When officers asked, he gave the phone number for Silas Thornton, 408-8669. So now there's a investigative team division meeting, and they're talking, and they're sitting around talking. Chris Corbett, you're going to hear from, he's a phone analyst. He's the one that's going to talk to you about what cell phones can and can't do, and how it relates into this particular case. And you'll hear a little bit more about that in a second. So as they're sitting around their meeting and they're sharing notes about what they've learned, what he says is that 408-8669 was in contact with Brandi Peters all day long on the 19th. This is the number that Henry Segura says belonged to Silas Thornton. So what does law enforcement do? They go down and interview Silas Thornton. Lives down in the South Choppy area, in McCullough County, south of town. When they interview Silas Thornton, what he says is, yeah, it was my phone. It got damaged at one point. It got wet. I put it in a bag of rice. I was with Henry Segura at the time, and I was working. They're both welders. I was with Henry Segura during the time period. I put it in a bag of rice. It was his suggestion to do so. And he left that phone in Henry Segura's truck. And then from that point on, Henry Segura used that phone. Not Silas Thornton. Henry Segura. Didn't tell law enforcement that back on the 19th or the 20th when he was interviewed. So now we have two phone numbers in play. We have the one that Henry Segura says is mine, the one that he says is Thornton's, that we've now learned is Henry Segura's. And what we find out when we analyze those is with regard to that 408-8669 number, at 11:30 a.m. there's a phone call from that phone to Brandi. But in that phone, for some reason, star 67 was used. Star 67 is the function that you use in order to hide who is calling. But she answered the phone, and they talked for 56 minutes, clearly indicating it's someone she knows and has a conversation with. Consistent, once again, with Henry Segura. Between 118 and 128, series of calls to Brandi, again, star 67 used for some reason, blocking his caller ID, but she obviously knows him because she talked to him just a little while ago on that same phone number. (2:13), another phone call, 2 minutes 35 seconds. Again, star 67 used, trying to hide it. Deception. At 2:19, so again, 2:13, almost 3 minutes on a phone call. Right afterward, at 2:19, she sends a text number to 509-4380. This is the phone number that Henry Segura says was mine. What does that say? The evidence shows in this particular case that this phone number, this phone call at 2:13, from the phone number that Henry Segura says wasn't his, it's Silas Thornton's, that he was keeping secret, that he kept using star 67 on to hide his identity, and that phone number, she sends a text to his regular number and says, "You hang up on me?" Tells you that phone call was Henry Segura, and that she then used his normal number to question about why he hung up. He hung up on me? What does that tell you? 2:19, they fighting? On day of murder? Shortly thereafter, there's another phone call from 408-869 to Brandi where he uses star 67 again. Again, hiding. Once again, that's a phone number that Henry Segura gave to law enforcement as Silas Thornton's phone number. But law enforcement investigates further. And they find multiple friends, Silas Thornton, Tyra Wilcoxon, and Miss Hawthorne Smith, to all say, I communicate with Henry Segura on that phone number around the times of the murder, those dates surrounding the murder. So they have independent confirmation from not only Silas Thornton, but also other friends and girlfriends of Henry Segura that that is in fact the number that he utilizes, that 408-8669 number that he says wasn't mine. It was Silas Thornton's phone number. Deception. Micro-emotions, deception. So now the next question is, was there motive? We've already seen the 219 phone call or text message. Did you hang up on me? So there's some sort of fighting going on between the two of them. Motive usually involves, as I said, money, love, relationship, jealousy, things along those lines. And what we find out is shortly there before this murder occurred, Henry Segura is behind on his child support payments of over $20,000. $20,000, a lot of money. We're also going to hear from a friend of his, lifelong friend of his, who's going to come in and testify. And what he's going to tell you is that he's also a welder at the time. And that they were discussing, he and Henry were talking about getting a job over in Afghanistan. Lots of money to be made over in Afghanistan during this time period, doing welding and things, 6-figure jobs. A lot of money to be made. But to go to Afghanistan, you have to have a visa from the United States and Afghanistan to travel to and from. The problem with that is he can't get one if he owes over $2,500 in child support. So it's not only the $20,000 in child support in arrears, but now that child support for Javante stands in the way of making six-figure salaries and traveling to do so? Is there means? Strength, murder weapon. Does he have one? He's a big guy, a welder. Opportunity to see him here in court, of course. But that's what he does. As a welder, got to move metal around on a regular basis. Big, strong. Does he have the strength to carry it out? Again, as I said, one of these blows crushed the skull. Does he have the strength? I'll say he does. Does he have a gun? Again, that lifelong friend, Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore's former military. He knows about guns through both military and personal. And what he's going to say is, prior to the murders, I saw Henry Segura with a .32 in his car. Again, .32 is the kind of weapon that Brandi was shot with. Milo shot with. You're also going to hear that he's asked his girlfriend and told her, I need a throwdown gun, just before the murders. Law enforcement will explain what a throwdown gun is. A throwdown gun is one that you can just throw down and it's not traceable back to you. She didn't supply it, but that's what he requested and talked to her about doing. Why? So we know he's got the motive. We know he's got the means to the gun, the strength, asking for a throwdown gun. But does he have the opportunity? Remember, does he have access to the kids? Was he actually at the home? He says, I was home all day. Check my phone records. Well, access to the home, he's not heavily involved with the kids, but he does know them and was at one point. They know him. Obviously behind on child support. House was not broken into. Door wasn't kicked in. Does he have the access to the home where somebody would let him in? Got communication with Brandi all day? I would submit, yes. He would have access to the home in that manner. We also go back to cell phone records. Once again, they compare the phone record for Brandi, but now they're also looking at the undisclosed phone, as we call it. This is the phone number, that 8669, that Henry Segura elected not to tell law enforcement officers when he was told about the death of his son, and then go to law enforcement officers. Both phones are inactive between 6:53 and 7:23. And if you go back and you think about the times of the death that we previously talked about, the inactiveness of her phones, that long list of scrolling ended at 8:21, with the last text message that she sent out prior to that. Brandi's continually remains inactive, never returns. Two short data sessions, and your data sessions are internet type access your phone, but that doesn't mean you're actually searching the internet. Your phone can auto refresh certain internet things. If you have, say, CNN pulled up on your phone and you aren't using your phone, it still may refresh, even though you're not actually having it in your hand. Those are what data sessions are. So there's data sessions at 7:23, and then a text is sent at 7:37. And both phones, again, are inactive from 7:37 to 8:21. And at 8:21, that's the time period that we know that last call went out of that last time that we know Brandi's phone is powered down at 8:21. At 8:21, exact same time period, exact same time, Henry Segura makes a 2-second call, immediate disconnect. No connection. 1-1000, 2-1000, butt dial. Now, this is where cell phone stuff gets even more interesting. When you're talking about cell phone, there are certain things called RTT. What is a time calculation, time distance calculation? And the way that cell phones are structured, that the signal that your cell phone gets takes a certain amount of time to get from one to the tower to your cell phone and back. That's your time distance calculation does. It doesn't give you an exact GPS coordinate. Back then, keep in mind we're talking about 2000. We're not talking about today. Phones are a little bit different now than they were then. Doesn't give you an exact GPS coordinate, but it does give you distance from the tower. So if you know the location of the tower, if you know the distance, you can create kind of a little arc, or at least the general area you're talking about there. And if you know where all these towers are, you can plot it out. You can actually go down even further. Each tower has got a section, 3 different sections to them. And they go out in roughly a third, but they're not always exactly a third. So it's kind of divided up into 3 pieces of a pie, if you will. And that can narrow it down in that particular direction that the phone was communicating. If it was on this particular sector off this particular tower, we know it's going to be roughly in that 3rd quadrant in that general direction. And you can kind of get an idea of where phones are during that time period using this database. So law enforcement can go back and do exactly what Henry Segura said to do. Go back, check my phone records. It shows I'm home. 509-4380. And the phone was exactly where he said it was. It was at his home. The only problem was everything was inactive. Everything was passive. There's nothing outgoing. The phone was there, but was Henry Segura? So now we go back and we take a look at this 408-8669 number, the one that he says belongs to Silas Thornton, not my phone number. And you take a look at that particular phone number, which we now know to be Henry Segura's. And when you plot those sectors and time distance calculation, the rough sector right there, there's our Saddle Creek Run with the arcs. Those are the communications between 6 o'clock and 8:21, November 19th, 2010, at the time of the murder, on that phone number. But we're not done. What law enforcement then do is they go out and they get with Silas Thornton, and they have Silas Thornton go with them, and they purchase the exact same phone that Silas Thornton said was his that now belongs to Henry Segura, that 8669. And they take that exact same phone, they hook it up to the exact same carrier, and they run a series of tests. They run phone calls, they run text messaging, and they run data access. Almost 100 of them are amassed during this time period. Okay? They stand inside Brandi Peters' home. They stand inside the living room where the murder occurred. You go to his house, Henry Segura's house. And they go back and they plot it, just like they did for that 8669 phone number. And when they plot all the data that they utilized, looks familiar. It was exactly the same. They did this from her living room, and this is the data that they got. And that's the data from that 8669 phone number. What we know, Henry Segura has got the motive, he's got the means, and he's got the opportunity for this murder. We're not done. You're going to hear from Dr. Kevin McElfresh. Dr. McElfresh has got a long history of analyzing and interpreting DNA over 30 years. He does analysis on, quite frankly, mass type stuff. So he's looking at very low frequency or very low amounts of DNA and making determinations. In fact, he even does testimony, or he does stuff for the Department of Defense with Whom the Unknown Soldier. He had a hand in the analysis of September 11th. He had an analysis of the Indonesia and identifying the victims of those particular events. And he goes back and he makes an analysis. And he is asked to take a look at a grab bar, a DNA swab from a grab bar that is right there in the bathtub, right above where the children are found. And what he finds is a mixture containing Henry Segura's DNA. Ladies and gentlemen, when you put together the motive, the means, the deception, the opportunity, the DNA, you're left with one conclusion: that Henry Segura committed this particular murder and is responsible for the murder of Brandi Peters, Tamaya and Tanaya Peters, and Javante Segura. Thank you.